Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and today on the show we have regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, who's one of 3 reps for the town of Brattleboro. Welcome, Emilie.
Hello, Olga. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And Senate Pro Tem, as well as Senator for Windham County, Becca Balint. Hello, Becca.
Good morning.
And are you all still, I'm still feeling a little wigged out by the Zoom lady voice that came on a few minutes ago.
Yes, I don't know. I don't know if it was the Facebook voice or a Zoom voice, but if
about the recording.
Yes, that was a whole new
Yep.
piece of the puzzle that's never appeared before. So
Yeah.
And part of me was like, well, I should hope so. That is part of the purpose of this today.
Yeah.
So
I know.
thank you, Emilie. Thank you, Becca, for joining us today. Congratulations. You made it through another legislative session.
A historic session, Olga, one like no other.
And for you, what made it historic?
Oh my gosh.
I mean, I know my answer to the question, but what would be yours?
Well, to take over in the Senate as the leader of the chamber during a pandemic, during a lot of economic uncertainty, being sworn in the week we had an insurrection at the Capitol. We had a new president being sworn in a few weeks into our session. So much change at once. We had so much pressure on us to both think about short-term needs of Vermonters while juggling the long-term. In speaking with my chair of appropriations, it was the most complicated budget she's ever had to help put together because of the federal funds involved. And again, the different timelines. And, and for me personally, being the first woman to do the job, certainly I thought about that a lot and expectations about what people thought women leaders should be like or what I should be like. And also just having 2 new leaders in those chambers at the same time. So when I look back at what we were actually able to get done, it's kind of remarkable. People really, on most days, brought their best selves to getting work done for Vermonters. Emilie, do you agree?
I do. And, in all of those things, there's also sort of naming that we did it all virtually.
Yes.
And so weren't able to make the eye contact through all of those really important, difficult decisions. And yeah, we did do it. And I think people understood the gravity and the opportunity in the moment. And it really helped us show up through the tough times and the fatigue.
Yeah. And the other piece of this, which I know is near and dear to Emilie's heart, and I'm sure it is to you too, Olga, which is this was the most accessible legislative session we've ever had, especially for those of us in the southern part of the state. Yeah. Right. So normally you would have to drive 2 hours one way. Maybe you got to testify, or maybe your committee that you went to testify actually ran out of time and you didn't get to testify. Maybe you tried to get into a committee room, but it was all crowded and all you could do is, sit outside the room, with a bunch of lobbyists and advocates trying to listen in, and then get back in your car and drive another 2 hours. So that doesn't work for us in Windham County and in Bennington County when I think about my colleagues right across the county line. And so that's exciting to think about. How do we, going forward, integrate what we love about in-person, keeping the doors of the State House open, really, as Emilie said, being together in community, eye contact, hearing the lilt of people's voices, seeing their mannerisms in a different way, but also having it accessible to people back home is exciting to think about those changes. So.
And has the legislature, the State House, been able to have conversations about that? Do you have kind of a plan going forward about how we can keep that level of accessibility?
A lot of conversations. As you might imagine, with any sort of legislative endeavor, there are a lot of committees involved. So there is not one person or even two people that make those decisions. So essentially you've got a Senate Rules Committee, you've got a House Rules Committee, you have a joint Rules Committee, you have a joint Legislative Management Committee, you have a State House Advisory Committee, you have
the Institutions Committee on both sides.
Exactly.
Yes.
You have input from Sergeant of Arms, Capitol Police, all the attorneys and joint fiscal, since they are in the Capitol, what we call the Capitol complex. And so we are starting to have those conversations. Those are going to be difficult conversations all summer and fall as we try to figure this out. But it seems pretty clear that unless we have another big wave of infections, which I'm knocking on wood, which hopefully we won't have, that the House and Senate legislators will be back in person. The State House will be open, and then we'll figure out how to integrate the remote piece of it for witnesses, perhaps for fiscal analysts, for lawyers. And so we don't necessarily have to go back to exactly the way it was before with having all of those people in the same room at once. We do think it's important for legislators to be present. And so, we are having those conversations now about if we are going to move in the direction of being back in person. There are some committee rooms that were unhealthy even before the pandemic hit. And that's actually even more true for the House than it is for the Senate. We had an airflow quality test essentially done, and the House rooms are in much worse shape than we are in the Senate. And so there may be a kind of dance that we'll have to do of doing some split shifts in some of the bigger rooms. So it's not clear what that's going to look like.
But I heard that there was going to be these like cool 360-degree cameras in all the committee rooms. That, they're smart cameras that when you speak, they zoom in on you. So it's not like, I don't know how often, if you've ever been in a meeting where everyone's in person, except you're the virtual one and you're just like sitting in a laptop, not really seeing anything. That is not a quality experience to have. But with these cameras, it'll be much more like the experience that you get when you're watching someone on Zoom and you see the individual face talking. It won't just be like this back of the room view.
What I like about that too is, sorry, Becca.
No, go ahead.
As someone who does not cover the State House regularly, because just 2 hours driving from Southern Vermont, I would sometimes listen to different audio versions that I could stream over VPR, even like when you were all on the floor. But because I didn't know everyone really well, sometimes just hearing the voice without seeing a face is really, really tough.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's nice to be able to have a face to go with a voice.
I think that there's probably a lot of legislators who have been doing this longer than either of us have, who really, really struggle, like might have believed in the democracy aspect of being on YouTube, but really, really struggled with the reality of having so many eyes on them all the time, both in terms of like couldn't really get their head around it and function in that way, and then also really just were incredibly uncomfortable for the whole period from it. And so the other thing that I appreciate about the smart camera is that you get a little bit of a break. So if you're not talking, it's not eyes on you. And so I think that's also a nice little piece that you get breaks from being stared at all day.
I was talking about that dynamic this morning, Emilie, with an interview I did early this morning, is that we say all the time, but people forget it. We're a citizen legislature, and we're not necessarily all ready for prime time. And I mean that in a very loving way, right? And so it is, I think it's been very jarring for some legislators, as Emilie said, who have done it for a while and perhaps are older or are not really on social media right now, to all of a sudden have everything that they say, every gesture they make be scrutinized, not just by Vermonters, but now that it's over Zoom and YouTube, very easy to link, obviously, to Twitter and Facebook. And I think that has been really tough for some legislators, realizing that everything that they say needs to try to, we need to be careful in our words about context and nuance. And of course, we don't necessarily live in a world right now that appreciates nuance a whole lot. And so that's been a challenge for many of my colleagues. And for me as a leader, to try to figure out, how do I get them the training that they need, not just around really important consequential things like gender and race and equity, but also, how do you run a meeting over Zoom? It's very different from trying to run a meeting in person. And what are the skills that we need to work on in that setting that weren't necessarily top of mind for people before? And Emilie and I have talked about this a bunch throughout the session, which is, there's something really lost when you're not together having those hard, conversations in person, and you can't take time in the same way, right? Like if you're in a committee room and there's a big quiet pause for a while, it's not as awkward as if you're all on Zoom and everyone's just looking straight ahead, right? And nobody's saying anything, right? Whereas in a room, you can all look to the chair or look to the witness, and everybody knows, oh, we're giving space to the witness, or we're giving space to the chair to figure out what's next. But that doesn't translate over Zoom. So then people try to fill in that time, right? And so it's fascinating.
Well, with Vermont's broadband too, and everyone's not talking, everyone's like, am I frozen? What just happened here?
I realized that I have this like weird new twitch where I do that to my face to check to see if I'm frozen or not. And it probably looks really strange to people who are watching it.
Well, it's true. I realized that I do this thing with my throat when I'm thinking. And I knew it intellectually, but until I was on Zoom, I was like, oh, that's what it looks like when I do that thing. And what does that look like for people at home? Or what's she doing with her throat? So it's very strange. And I heard on some podcast how plastic surgery the requests for plastic surgery have gone up dramatically because people are seeing themselves up close. They're like, oh, that's what I look like. So that's a sad commentary.
That is a sad.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I want to check in on some of the big measures or bills that passed this session. Am I correct in that you sent an approximately, you being the legislature, approximately $7 billion state budget to the governor last week? Yes. And so far it seems like he's going to sign it, but has he signed it yet?
Hasn't been signed yet. I did receive some pretty clear indications from the governor's office last week that they did not anticipate vetoing either the budget or the tax bill. Of course, until it's in the can,
pen hits the paper.
Exactly. But we did work really hard over the last few weeks with the administration to come to agreement. And for people who may be watching, it wasn't a lot of disagreement about how to spend the money. There was some, but it was mostly about what money was being used. And that's a little inside baseball. It was about how much of the federal dollars, how much of the, general fund dollars we were anticipating another boost in revenue from sales. And so it was a lot of figuring out what money to spend for what projects. But in terms of the big ticket items around broadband, climate, housing investments, childcare, what am I forgetting, Emilie?
Those are the four for me.
And so we did have a little workforce. Thank you. We did have a little bit of a, I would say, a philosophical and values disagreement about what the ARPA funds were supposed to be used for. So we had more of the money set aside for what we were calling human capital, human investments around workforce development, around thinking about the needs of individual workers and families. And that was a disagreement. The governor had said to us, well, I want most of the ARPA funds to be spent on, he kept saying, bricks and mortar. I want them to be here, 20, 30, 40 years from now. And one of the things that we kept saying is that we didn't seem like the guidelines that came down from the federal government were really going to be giving that indication that that was where the money was supposed to be spent, especially given, as you said, there's probably going to be an infrastructure bill coming. So Emilie, I'm sure you've thought about this too. I don't want to monopolize.
No, I mean, it made, I think the conversation, what's so funny about what's really just incredible about all of this, is that the conversation about sort of that first pot of COVID relief money, it really felt like this is all we were going to get and we were going to do it the best we could. And then with ARPA, it's very much in the context of this is what we already did with the COVID relief. We know the infrastructure bill is likely coming, might not be exactly what it's imagined as now, but we know there's going to be another huge infusion coming. And so it really changes the way we have a lot of the conversations about what's possible and what needs to happen immediately versus what we're investing in and setting up for long term. It's a really different conversation than it would be otherwise. And I think in that context, it becomes much more important to put people first and put Vermonters first and have the infrastructure follow, which is, also what the federal government has done, with ARPA being a much more sort of human-centered set of guidelines and the infrastructure bill coming after too.
Right.
Yeah. Well, what I find interesting about that conversation is, as Becca said, there was negotiation happening between the legislature and the governor about bricks and mortar or human capital. And it feels like this has been an ongoing conversation with the administration, in that, early on, the governor spoke about affordability a lot. And it's like, well, that's great. I think a lot of people would agree that Vermont needs to be more affordable, but what makes something affordable? For him, it was keeping taxes down. For someone else, it might be more benefits. And it feels like that basic conversation has not changed. Am I wrong with that?
No, and in the same way, we're, it's not as if this budget was straight social human infrastructure. It had a huge amount of physical infrastructure in it too. It has the broadband and the housing, and a lot of money going to IT. But it's like, it really sort of comes down to all of the framing. And what's interesting in this context is that of sort of plenty rather than the context of scarcity that we were operating in even last year, is that the governor's office is that much more comfortable saying, well, let's cut revenue here and let's cut revenue here and let's cut revenue here and spend, without regard for like really setting us up for a future that's that takes into account sort of the tail of the federal money and what that's going to feel like, what that transition time is going to feel like, that starts setting us up so that we might be able to sustain some of the incredible work we've been able to do this year and doing next year. And so it becomes possible in this time, this sort of like crucible crisis time, to really just be acting in the now and not be thinking about the human side of the future that we're planning for, which is for me a lot of what the affordability mantra is also about. It's about like getting a deal today, but not worrying about tomorrow.
Becca?
Two things that I thought of while you were speaking, Emilie, is that we've also, I want to take some credit, and by take some credit, I mean the legislature, take some credit. We really brought the governor along on seeing that childcare investment is an economic investment. Yes, it's investing in people and family and communities, but it is an economic benefit to so many people to have an actual system. The other piece is getting him to see that investing in climate justice work is also around our economic health, our community's health, and that we are going to be paying more and more money long-term to help communities withstand climate change. We are going to be having to help families figure out how are they going to insulate their homes so they're not incredibly hot in the summer and freezing in the winter. And so we have moved him on that, and that feels really good. The other thing that I want to say is that when you look at the kind of conversation that we're having around human investment versus sort of bricks and mortar, the other real sticking point with our negotiations over the last few months has been about how we could swap out some money to set aside to invest in the pension system. And so I think it was lost a lot in the conversation that I think what's important for your viewers to know is that it's absolutely spelled out in the ARPA bills from the federal government. We can't spend ARPA funds on pensions, on public pensions. Okay.
Strangely, you can spend them on private pensions.
That is kind of weird.
It's a senator from somewhere won something. It's like there have been a few interesting stories about sort of how he managed to get that across the finish line.
So there has been a disconnection for Vermonters when they see that we have this crisis coming to us around funding the pensions and also healthcare benefits for pensioners. And why can't we spend this federal money? So we're prohibited from doing so. However, what we said to the governor is, well, then let's swap in some of those federal funds for things that we can, and then free up the general fund dollars to set aside for pensions. And that was a point of contention. That is the one thing that was still sort of in my mind in the last few days of I could still see a veto coming down over that because he was so strongly publicly averse to us doing that. Mm-hmm. But I think it's the very least we can do as a sign of good faith to all those people who are paying into the system. They want to know that the state government is doing their part to set aside a big chunk of investment too. And I'm sure, Emilie, you might have other things to say on that, but that I don't want that to get lost. It won't solve the problem, but $150 million on top of us meeting our obligations to folks who hold pensions this year. So that's not even the total. That's on top of what we were investing this year. So.
Thank you, Becca. We have just about 5 minutes before we need to go to break. So I want to check in, excuse me. In the second half, we can dive into some of the bills that did or did not pass. But before we leave this section, what do you think is really key for our listeners to understand about this legislative session and where Vermont's heading next?
I think we have named the problems and started addressing them at the same time, which is really powerful. I think there have been previous sessions we were able to name some of the problems. For instance, broadband has been named over a number of years. The housing crisis has been named and identified over a couple of years. But the fact that we were able to name it and start solving it is huge. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's groundbreaking. Those are really two of the biggest issues that hold, childcare too. That's another one. Huge. We've really there's been momentum over years and years around the crisis point on all three of those issues. And because of the pandemic and because of the investment and because of the groundwork we did, it's not we needed all three of those pieces to really move those ideas into reality, into really starting to solve those problems. So for me, those are the three biggest things to take away from sort of the work we got done this year is really. And that makes individual families' lives easier, all three of those things.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that I would agree with everything that Emilie just said, and the one thing that I would add, which sort of undergirds all of this, is really started this session wanting to very intentionally try to restore some faith in democratic institutions. And it is I can't say we're in actually a better situation at the federal level than we were a few months ago. Things feel very precarious. Things feel very dangerous. But I do feel so good about the work that we did across chamber, across the branches of government, among the different parties within the House and Senate, that matters. That matters, that citizens can see a functioning government that is trying desperately to meet the needs of Vermonters, and that the people and the families are not getting lost in political posturing, which it's very difficult not to feel despondent when you look at what's happening in Congress right now. And that was something that I was thinking about a lot throughout the session. What are we doing that can reassure our community members that we're actually doing the work of our communities and individual Vermonters when we're up there? And so in that way, it was nice that it coincided with this sort of opening up in terms of seeing the work that we're doing in real time. I think that really helped.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think for me, this is a little bit of some of last year and some of this year. What this pandemic and this process has shown for me is what we've tackled so many hard issues, and they remain complicated and they remain tough to solve, but there were many issues that we addressed head on and made progress on.
Yes.
And so I think for me, it kind of renewed some faith in our community and our state and our people as a whole to change things when we do have that collective will and that the power of that collective will.
Yeah.
The Montpelier Happy Hour will be back in a moment right after we hear from our underwriters. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I am your host, Olga Peters, and I am speaking with Representative Emilie Kornheiser and Senator/Senate Pro Tem, Becca Balint. Hello, thank you for being here. Emilie, let's dive into unemployment insurance, because that is a system that has been getting a workout in this past year and a half.
Yeah, so we've talked on the show many times before about unemployment insurance. And for me, it's really come to stand in for some real historic failures of government and governance that I was, over the last, especially the first 6 months of the pandemic, but over the last year, when the pandemic started, we imagined that we could use the unemployment insurance system as really a substitute for family medical leave, as a way of making sure that people could still have some income while they were home staying safe. And we modified the unemployment insurance system slightly so that, what good cause is, because for folks who have not had to negotiate this system before, the unemployment insurance system, you only are allowed to receive benefits if you were released from employment for a reason that is not your own fault. So if you are fired, you are not eligible for unemployment. And if you quit, you are not eligible for unemployment. But we changed the system just a little bit to make sure if people were leaving for health reasons, basically, because they needed to quarantine or something like that, or they didn't have childcare, that they would still be eligible. And so there was so much promise there for me in the government's ability to adapt and to take care of Vermonters' needs in a time of crisis. And then we saw an IT system that is from about 50 years old, and that was not able to adapt to meet the needs of the system. And we also saw a bureaucracy that was unable to adapt to meet the needs of the system, that made decisions around hiring and outsourcing that did not deliver good customer service. We saw leadership that wasn't taking responsibility for those things and seemed too caught up in sort of the quagmire of their own problems to think strategically about what Vermonters needed. And a lot of confusion and fear from there. And we saw legislators step up and really like jump in and start trying to help, really doing like case management to help people get their unemployment insurance benefits. And that was kind of amazing because a lot of legislators have lived somewhat charmed lives. And it's how, we've talked about what a citizen legislature means when the citizen legislator is not paid enough to really make a living. And so we saw a lot of people understanding like viscerally what the problems in our system were for the first time. And so this is so much preamble, I'm sorry. And so
it's all important.
It's context. It's very important context. Yes.
It's a long story. And so what I felt like we were entering this session with in January was a real shared understanding of the profound problems in the unemployment insurance system and what it would take to fix them. But what happened at first is that the committees of jurisdiction were really pulled in other directions at first, and not able to focus on the unemployment insurance system, and still focusing instead on how to get more money to Vermont businesses. It turns out that Vermont businesses have received more money both per capita and as a share of GDP than any other state in the union, which is really incredible. I mean, part of that is how large our appropriations are that we get from the federal government, but it's a combination of how folks were able to access PPP and all that. Anyway, we did a lot of supporting of businesses, and the unemployment insurance programs were really starting to fall through the cracks as something that wasn't solvable. There were a lot of bills on the wall and not a lot of movement. And then one sort of little detail of the whole thing is that the way unemployment insurance rates are structured, if we had not done anything, the cost of unemployment for businesses would have skyrocketed because of the calculations include how much was sort of paid out over the last year. And so it would have moved from what was called Schedule 1 up to the highest schedule, Schedule 5. And so the Senate took the lead in doing some tweaks to make sure that was balanced out. And then the question was asked in the Senate, well, if we're doing this for employers, what are we doing for employees and for all of the folks who have been caught up in this really intense quagmire? Becca, perhaps you would like to take the storyline from there, unless you want me to keep on talking for another 20 minutes.
Well, I don't mind, since I'm pulled in lots of different directions as pro tem, and I know that the play-by-play, you probably can give people many more details. But so I'll just, simply put, we did want to pass a package that was relief to businesses and also some increased benefit to workers. And what we've settled on was something called the extra dependent benefit. And I don't want, again, I can see us like we could go down this whole other rabbit hole of, why we made that decision. But so we were able to pass it after a lot of work in the Senate, bringing people along. That was important to have a balanced package, send it to the House, and their committee in the House Commerce Committee, looked at the work that we had done in the Senate, and they actually came to some different conclusions.
And I can take it back from there.
Yeah.
So, and the Senate in this dependent care benefit was acknowledging what some people have called the she-cession, in that, providers, those with dependents, are those who seem to have suffered disproportionately through the economic impacts of the pandemic. So it was a real acknowledgement of the particular face of this recession. And so when it came over to the House Commerce Committee looked at this and said, our IT system, this is my very charitable interpretation of the story, just so everyone knows I'm being charitable.
I was very curious to see how this
our Commerce Committee had conversations with the Department of Labor, who would have to implement this change, and said, our IT system actually cannot handle dispersing dependent care benefits. And took out that portion of the bill, changed the calculation around how business relief happened to actually like make it simpler. And I think, that was an improvement. And then also the Senate sent over this like really great pile of studies, but it was so many, and usually the Senate hates studies and the House loves studies. But in this case, I think some of their compromising wound up with like everyone who was a little bit upset got their own study added to the end of the bill. Is that what happened? So it was like 5 studies tacked onto this bill. So that's what the Commerce Committee passed out. I was sort of beside myself that there was nothing in there for beneficiaries, and a lot of my colleagues were too. It came over to the Ways and Means Committee as it was supposed to, and we had a lot of conversations with the administration. At one point I said, we have a spaceship on Mars right now. And so I don't want you to tell me it's not possible. I want you to tell me what you'll need to make it possible. Mm-hmm. But sometimes, when people feel very much under stress, they just close up and say, no, no, no. So trying to move beyond the no to what can we do? Mm-hmm. The one thing that the IT system is capable of is paying out sort of an extra supplement a month. And we know that because they're already doing that with the federal supplement. Right. Because some of the other things, the sort of mathy aspects we wanted to do, they couldn't do because the programmers who did the original programming, the last time it was programmed was in 1984. And so those people are definitely not still working for the Department of Labor. It's very likely they are not still working at all, and they might not even be alive. So
what is it with Vermont and IT? I mean, really?
Yeah. And we should maybe someday do a whole episode on IT debacles. But so anyway, we added in this supplemental benefit that was essentially sort of equal fiscally to the benefit the Senate had to try to add some balance to the bill. And we streamlined the studies to do a really deep exploration and a companion task force on like, what should this system do to meet Vermonters' needs, both beneficiaries and businesses, how to deal with the very different levels of fraud. There's people making paperwork mistakes is considered fraud. And then like organized crime, sending in sending in bots to file fake claims is also considered fraud, but maybe we should think of them differently. So anyway, great study, much negotiations, House, Senate, came on out though as a bill that I think has something for absolutely everyone in it in the very best way. And so really, really excited that we're able to meet both business and beneficiaries' needs with this bill that I took up like 15 minutes of the show explaining, but I spent a lot of time thinking about unemployment and how much it failed Vermonters and what we can do about it. So
yeah. And I think Emilie and I were reflecting on this morning that we both did a lot of work in each of our chambers and our committees to make sure that this bill didn't fall apart. Mm. We really did. So it is, it's something I think we both feel really proud of. I hope that in the end, the governor will either let it pass into law or will sign it into law, because we were both very committed to making sure that it didn't all fall apart, that businesses did need the rate relief. It was going to be a dramatic shock and very difficult for a lot of small businesses. And long term, we have the money to be a little bit more generous in the benefits that we're paying out. And so I do feel a lot of satisfaction that all of the hard work that we put in behind the scenes seems to have paid off. So
what I think is so important about this conversation is, and why it's worth 15 minutes of the show, is because one thing we really need to remember, we've talked a lot about how this pandemic did not impact everyone equally.
Yeah.
And in the same way, the recovery for everyone is not going to be the same and not happen at the same pace. So just because the state has this great plan to be completely reopened by such and such a date doesn't mean people with vulnerable immune systems will be able to return to work at that date,
Right.
or families will have childcare by that date.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, thank you for your work on that, both of you.
And Olga, I think what you just said is so, so important. And I've said it throughout the pandemic, but I think it's so important as we head into recovery that we say it again, which is people did not all have the same experience of the last year.
Mm-hmm.
And that is true around work. It's true around connectivity. It's true around whether you did or did not have childcare. It is true if you lost a loved one. Having to grieve during this time, very, very different from other times in history, even just a couple years ago. And so I was saying to senators in my closing remarks, as we open back up, we have to remember that we have to learn again how to be in community with one another, because we're out of practice. And we're coming out of community at a time of really heightened anger and fear and anxiety. And so it is so critical that we remember that all of us who had a relatively easy time in the pandemic, and by that I mean nobody in my family got really sick, nobody in my family died, I had a roof over my head, I never worried that I wasn't going to have food or medicine or toilet paper, all of those things. And if we can just even remember that one thing, it's going to help all of us as we try to get back to being in community with one another.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Becca. Speaking of community, the legislature also took some measures on issues of racial justice and equity. And one thing they did was make an apology around Vermont's history with eugenics. Becca, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that was something that started on the House side in the House General Committee. And for me personally, it was a really important gesture to make, because I, as part of my master's in history, really studied Native American communities, Native American land claims. And when I was writing my thesis, my professor, who was in Massachusetts, not in Vermont, said to me, before you do any more research and writing on your thesis, you need to read this book, because you're a Vermonter. You need to read the book, Breeding Better Vermonters. And I said, oh, I don't know. What is that about? And she said, well, it's about the eugenics movement in Vermont. And again, I said, what are you talking about? Like, I did not know about it. I didn't understand that it had been housed at UVM. I didn't understand the interaction between UVM and the Professor Perkins there, and how you had people within the German government, looking to see what it was that we were doing with that eugenics project here in Vermont. And so to finally be able to say that it was a horrible chapter in Vermont's history, and that it still has trauma in those families and those communities, that's what I think is so important. It isn't, the resolution really isn't structured about, oh, this happened all that time ago and that was really bad and we've moved on. It was, we're acknowledging that this kind of betrayal of families and communities has long-term consequences. And so I think it was a really important topic to take up for so many reasons. And I know the House did a really, really careful job with it, spent months on it, making sure they could get it right. So by the time it came to us, a lot of the homework and the context and the background had really been done. And it was just about really educating my colleagues about this chapter. And people had varying levels of understanding. But one of the things that I highlighted for our government operations committee, when I met with the chair and a couple members from the committee, was that there was this tension around, well, were Native people impacted in the same way that other people were impacted? How come we don't see a lot of Native families appear on the census? And I said, well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about why people are misidentified on a census and what are all the reasons, culturally and politically why that might happen. And that census documents from that time, right? That was the historian in me that could say, let's look at how census records are impacted about, that what you're seeing at face value may not be exactly what's happening under the surface. And so there were some really interesting and important conversations that we had.
And for listeners who want to sort of dive deeper into that conversation, I think about 2 months ago, people can find in the archive, we had a conversation with Rich Holshook about that.
Oh, great.
Yes.
So if folks want to listen to a longer episode that's just about issues of eugenics and Native American land claims, they can pop into the archives for that one.
Great.
Mm-hmm. And I will try to link it in the show notes of this show.
Fancy pants.
Yeah, I'll tell you. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think too, Olga, on a much bigger scale, one of the things that Emilie and I talk about a lot as friends and as colleagues is that how we show up to work is different because we are women. It is different because, as a queer person, it's different because of cultural background. And that the more that we keep reminding each other of that, the better product we get. Because there have been multiple times when I've had to say to a colleague, that is your experience. That is not my experience in the world. That's not what it feels like for me to be in a room having this conversation. I come with all of this other discrimination that I experienced or experience that I had that does not necessarily lead me to feeling that I am sitting right now in my power in the same way that you are. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what has been extraordinary actually this year is that when we talked about the eugenics apology on the floor, when we talked about the trans panic defense on the floor, to some extent, when we talked about some really significant reforms in sexual assault bill legislation that we did, when we talked about those things on the floor, more and more people were able to really connect their personal experience and their personal lives to the changes we were making there. And that was really the eugenics bill in particular, some really powerful stories and vote explanations there from Vermonters, Vermont legislators. And so I think as we seek to further bring more people into the art and practice and difficulty of legislating, I think the more we'll be able to see that same awareness when we talk about racial justice or when we talk about class. But I think until we do that, those bills are going to continue to be much harder to pass and much harder to construct meaningfully and pass meaningful legislation. Though I think we did do a decent job of the racial justice work this year.
Yeah.
I think for me, especially with the conversation around eugenics, just about, connecting to our own pasts, part of my family is French Canadian and Abenaki. Mm-hmm. And when I was a kid, I was referred to with certain terms that I just took as normal. And it wasn't until I got older and I was talking with some history teachers and I was talking with some other historians where they would say, well, this term, that's a eugenics term. That's how they used to classify children using these words in school under the eugenics umbrella.
Right.
And what was the aha moment for me is that I think if you went back and you talked to those teachers and those adults who classified me that way and used those type of terms and said, you're talking eugenics. I mean, Vermont didn't have an active eugenics program at this point, but you're talking eugenics.
Right.
they would have been completely shocked. I
Mhm.
don't think that was going through their heads at all. And yet it was part of, as we say, the water they swim in.
Yeah.
And so I think for Vermont, we need, if we can learn anything from this eugenics, at least in my opinion, is how we need to be so careful about what we normalize. And why, when we have these conversations around social justice and racial justice, it's about, we need to be careful about what we have normalized that is hurting people. If I'm saying that in a clunky way, I'm sorry about that.
No, you're not.
No.
You're speaking quite eloquently. The more, and that's what I think is, as Becca said, the power of the eugenics apology is not about leaving history in the past. It's about naming, acknowledging, and creating a path forward for how to work with that history to make sure that we're able to heal from it and not just be carrying this detritus that hurts children as beautiful as you were, Olga.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Emilie.
I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry people did that to you, actually.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
Didn't
And
just
I'm
happen.
sorry that they didn't know.
Yes. Mistakes were made. Who made the mistakes? Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. Now you got me thinking while you were talking, Olga, about just the times over the past few months when I've been thinking really intensely about language and how it's used, and it can give permission in ways that are really uncomfortable and wrong. And so thinking about, we had a senator fairly early in the session use the expression cakewalk on the floor, and he did not understand the what a racialized term it was. He didn't understand the history of it. And there were several of us within the chamber and on staff who all heard it and reached out to him and said, hey, you use this term. Do you know what it means? Do you know why this is problematic? And it was so clear that he had no idea. And so we did an education piece that was like, not in a, you're a bad person sort of way, but we all have these terms that we have incorporated into our language that are not, they're not acceptable terms. They are alienating terms. They are othering terms. And he actually did a really lovely job apologizing on the floor and talking about the only way forward is if we have these really difficult conversations. If we are, nothing good ever comes from shame, right? Nothing good ever comes from it. So let's talk about it, shine light on it. Let's figure out, how did we learn these particular words or phrases, and how do we come to a more inclusive way of talking so that people feel like they have a place, that they are entitled to be there.
I'm looking forward to, as we do more work on the pupil waiting for schools, which is another fairly significant bill that we passed this year. That's S13. And that's really, setting us up to implement some real changes in education funding and finance in our state. A lot of the conversation is about how do we measure the cost of educating children who are living in poverty. And the conversations leading up to that used a variety of shorthand sometimes for children living in poverty, and had some really uncomfortable conversations around what it does cost and why, but rarely had the opportunity to talk about why it costs that much. And so I'm really looking forward to that. That's one of the task forces that's going to work this summer, to diving into that in a much more meaningful way and doing it in a way that really brings in those children that are living in poverty and their parents and people doing the best they can, and schools doing the best they can, but really trying to shift the narrative a little bit in those conversations, which I think is so much easier and more possible when we know people are watching us. And that's like, to sort of loop back to that first conversation we had about being on YouTube all the time. I'm very comfortable making people uncomfortable. And yet, there's a lot that I've sort of let go or let coast when I, because there's only so many battles you can pick. But knowing that some really difficult conversations are being witnessed helps me stand up with courage and make sure that I'm, really leading with my values and working from my values. So that's sort of another piece of that work that I think is really important. There was another bill, S79, which did not make it across the finish line, but is so close. And will any minute now. So it passed the House and the Senate and the House. And we didn't have time to get it all the way out of the House and over to the Senate because things need to sit on calendars for a certain number of days. And you need a super majority to suspend rules, like so much of a super majority that you need Republicans to agree to suspend rules, and neither body could suspend rules on this bill. So we'll pick it up at the veto session or in October, or maybe it'll wait till January. But anyway, what I was going to say about it is, on the floor, we were having just these appalling conversations about landlords and tenants and how tenants behave and what landlords need to care for, to deal with troubled tenants. And it was just, it was outrageous the way people were talking about tenants. Really just appalling. And knowing, I did have a moment of comfort where I was like, well, maybe most of the renters are too busy working to watch this terrible thing happening. That was like the most I could soothe my soul. But finally, some colleagues stood up and really talked about the rights of tenants in that conversation. But that's going to be a really important housing bill. That's the housing registry that will really set up a list of long-term and short-term rentals, have some really basic safety standards, like nothing fancy. And then also has really significant investments in it on building rehab.
And did you say that you think that bill can be taken up in October?
Or maybe even in Senator Balint? What's the timeline there?
So it is, when we come back for a veto session, we already have a bill that's been vetoed, 107, which I know is important to my chair of government operations and judiciary. And we will be returning for a veto session in June 23rd. And when you're in a veto session, you don't just have to do the work of addressing the veto. So this is when you're looking at Vermont law, if the governor calls us back for something, we have to do the work that we've been called to do. If we call ourselves back, we have more leeway into what we can get done, which is why when this bill didn't quite make it through all stages of, didn't make it through all stages of passage. Okay. And I just want to back up for a moment, because I think it's really important that people understand why we have the rules that we do and that they're actually not arbitrary.
No,
and
thank you.
No,
for backing up.
And so when Emilie says it has to appear on the calendar for a certain number of days, that is to give everybody a chance to examine the work, right? Make sure there aren't mistakes, make sure we haven't forgotten some important aspect. It's that time of slowing down, taking a pause and looking. So there's that piece that it's also like warning a meeting, right? It's like warning a bill, like you have to have time to examine it. And I know there were some frustrations both within the legislature and from sort of outside advocates on this bill and a couple other bills that didn't quite make it through all stages of passage. And I just want people to understand that these things don't just happen like out of the blue. They happen because somewhere along the line, the process got slowed down. Sometimes that's because a committee didn't do their work as efficiently as they could have. Sometimes it's because you couldn't get a witness in and you really needed to hear from them. Sometimes it's because somebody did the math wrong and didn't realize they had a certain number of days they needed to get it through all stages of passage. And so we had a little bit of an internal discussion in my chamber about what should we do as a caucus to force the Republicans to suspend rules. And I took a pretty strong stand that is not actually, as a body, where I want us to go. You do not want a majority acting like tyrants to the minority. We have rules for a reason. And so it is possible that we could get it done in June. The beauty of the biennium is none of these bills go away. They're still in play. If we don't get them done right now, we'll take them up in January. But I think we always say, well, we're better than what happens in DC. We're better. We're not those people. Well, let me tell you, some of the conversations that I heard last week, I was like, I think actually we're just a hair's breadth away from becoming that if we don't check ourselves, that we have a process that is perhaps, certainly looking through the lens of gender and race, there's work to do there. But in terms of the majority ramming something through because they can, that is not who I want to be. And I want to do due diligence in making sure we're doing good work. So I just wanted to make sure that got said.
Well, and we should note, thank you for saying that, Becca, because whether we like it or not, our system of having time on the calendar for people to review things and taking that time is also about letting voices of dissent have a place, because dissent is as much a part of the process as not. And so thank you for sharing what you just shared there, that dissent is part of the process.
Yeah.
And just ramming things through.
I mean, that's not the kind of government that I want to have.
Yeah.
Just not.
And I've been watching the clock, and yes, we are a little bit over time. So we should wrap up. But in lieu of a toast today, I want to make sure we touch on, I believe it was Resolution SR 11 to honor and commemorate George Floyd. If one of you could tell us a little bit about that resolution before we head out.
So it was a resolution that was passed, I believe, in both the House and the Senate. I know it was unanimous on the Senate side. And it was about acknowledging where we were a year from now, that a man's life was taken horribly. It goes to the heart of what we want policing to look like and not look like, but it also is an acknowledgement that it sparked a movement that has been building for decades. And unfortunately, this was the spark that acted as a catalyst to wake so many Americans up to the fact that we've never gotten our house in order. And so this is when I always push, if you're going to read one book to try to understand how we got there, please read Isabel Wilkerson's Caste to understand the caste system and how it works and operates here. But there's going to be a day of remembrance tomorrow. And I know I will be doing some deep reflecting on where we go from here.
Thank you. Thank you, Becca. Thank you, Emilie. Thank you to all your work you both did this session, and to all your colleagues. And here's to the next session. Cheers.